Hello, I'm Diane Okonski, your host for today's program. Before we get started, I just want to thank the INLUS members and donors for their contributions and support that make our webinars, classes, scholarships, and grants possible. If you are not yet a member of the INLUS, please consider joining us. Information can be found at inlus.org. Regarding today's program, we encourage you to submit your questions using Zoom's Q&A feature, and we will answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. Today's program is being recorded and will be available on the INLUS website and YouTube channel. So let's get started. I am happy to have with us today Caitlin Vitale-Sullivan. Kate is from the high desert of Idaho. She is intrigued by the human connection to nature, art, and music, and when not playing outside, she can be found playing fiddle or singing in the forest. She is a classically trained violinist. In 2013, she moved to Norway, where she was introduced to Scandinavian traditional music and the majestic fjords. Upon completion of her bachelor's in ecology, she moved to Sweden to complete a Fulbright grant studying the connection between Swedish cow calling music and landscape. She received an American Scandinavian Foundation grant this year to study Icelandic folklore traditions. She returned from Iceland just 3 weeks ago, where she studied with musicians Chris Foster and Bara Grimsdottir. Throughout the 2023 and 2024 educational year, she focused on learning about different categories of music, song, and traditional and musical tradition, and spoke to different members of the Icelandic folk music community about the revitalization of Icelandic folk music. As a teacher of folk song, Kate is interested in the methods that other tradition bearers are employing to engage audiences and bring more people, especially young people, into the folk music tradition. She has completed a Master's of Science in Agroecology and a Master's of Arts in Scandinavian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and is now starting her PhD in Scandinavian Studies at UW-Madison. Wow, Kate, what a list. Thank you so much for coming and welcome, and congratulations on your grant. I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentation, and so I'm just going to turn the mic over to you.
Thanks, Diane. And thank you to both Diane and Doug and for inviting me to talk to you all today. And just another thank you to the American Scandinavian Foundation for their generous grants and fellowships that they offer. As Diane said, you can go ahead and start that slideshow, Doug, if you're ready with that. As Diane said, I started this ASF grant thinking that I was going to learn about different types of Icelandic song tradition and teaching methods. One of my research areas is different teaching methods of folk song in different communities. Well, I went through a year of taking Zoom lessons with Chris Foster and Bára Grímsdóttir, and after spending some time in Iceland, what came out of this project was actually much broader and involved into many conversations with different folk music practitioners in Iceland. I came there looking for a definition of Icelandic folk music, which is a very hard question to answer. And I left with a much more detailed and nuanced picture of what Icelandic folk music is, what it isn't, and what practitioners that I spoke with want it to become. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with where I started in this journey, which is looking at several different categories of Icelandic song. I'm going to talk about them, and then we're going to share 3 different videos of those types of songs so you can have a chance to hear them. The first type of song I was looking at was rimur, rimur are a type of sung poem, and they exist in many different poetic structures. And each structure has a set of melodies that fits the structure. So if you have a rimur that is written in Ferskate, then you can sing it with any melody that fits the Ferskate form. Rimur are often very long, verse upon verse upon verse, and some of them are quite old, although there are also many that have been written pretty recently. The second type of musical tradition that I was interested in was tvísöngur, and tvísöngur is a type of two-voice song. Usually it was sung by men, but nowadays anyone sings it, and there are recordings of women singing it as well. But it's generally sung with two voices of the same register. And it's unique because it's in parallel fifths. So it sounds, maybe if you were to listen to it, and you'll hear an example of it in a few minutes, but some words that might pop into your head when you hear it for the first time are like medieval. That parallel fifths is something that was found in medieval music. But tvísöngur itself is unique because, while both singers are singing in parallel fifths, their voices, their parts actually cross at certain points. So there is no one voice that is the high part and one voice that is the low part. Both voices form both the harmony and the melody kind of at the same time. So as we listen to the tvísöngur piece, I'll invite you to close your eyes a little bit and see if you can tell who is singing what part. It's kind of a fun thing that you can do with those songs. The third type of song that I was interested in was tvísöngsstammur, which is a type of rimur, but sung with a harmony part in parallel fifths. So it doesn't have the crossing usually like tvísöngur does, but it is a little bit, usually one line with then a harmony line after that, and you'll hear an example of that as well. Then after that, I'll give a little bit of a talk about two of the main instruments that are considered Icelandic. I'll then talk about some collection methods that people were using to create this Icelandic canon of folk music. Then we'll get a little bit into what people are thinking about folk music in Iceland today, which is really the exciting part, I think, of what this project turned into. So we're going to go ahead and start with hearing a couple examples of this type of music. The first one, the rimur song, is sung by Bára Grímsdóttir. The second one, the tvísöngur, is sung by Linus and Chris. Both Chris was my teacher in Iceland. Linus is one of my friends. And the third, tvísöngsstammur, is from a video from the archive collection. So Doug, you can go ahead and share that first video.
Reisan byrjar þá nam því 30. dag júlí. Að veginum þar fóru frí, hinn fortöpuðu heljar því. Héldu síðan heljar grey úr höfnum fram elliða ei, í hádegistað svo fóru fley og flýttu sér ránarmey. Síðan lögðu suður haf, sagt þeirra ferðum af, í betra lagi bófum gaf, byrinn fyllti voðalaf. Öndverlega í ágúst ærin hrepptu storm og sjó, bátinn stærst úr böndum dró, bylurinn honum á græðið sló. Fullan mánuð fór geim, en feldur segl við allsýr heim, Níga létu hnakkmiðs reim, nálega var þá gæti á þeim. Rauna fólkið ráku á torg, riðlaði þangað gjörvöll borg, að kaupa þá sem komu með sorg, og keypuðu fyrir það ræðudorg.
Mér orðið stirt stef og stílvatn laust í höndum. Í langnættinu lítið sef, ljós í myrkri ekkert hef. Kaldur titra kreftur giktar böndum. Húmar að mitt hinsta kvöld, horf ég fram á veginn, gröfin móti gapir köld, gref ég á minn vonar skjöld. Rúnir þær sem ráðast hinum megin.
Ég að horfa hugfanginn í hlýjum sumarblænum, yfir litla lækinn minn sem líður fram hjá bænum. Ó, hve marga æskustund áður hér ég dvaldi, saklaust barn með létta lund og leggina mína taldi. Bæ lítinn byggði þar og blómum utan skreytti, yfir tún og engjarnar oft ég læknum veitti. Nú ekkert eins og fyrr, á öllu sé ég muninn. týndir leggirnir og litli bærinn hruninn. Æskan hverfur inn í dvín, allt líkt og draumur. Áfram líður ævi mín, eins og lækjar straumur. Meðan æðum yljar blóð og andinn má sig hræra, skal ég syngja lítil ljóð, læknum silfur tæra. Þegar ég uppgefinn og eitt hef kröftum mínum, langar mig í síðsta sinn að sofna á bökkum þínum.
So those were the three main types of song that I was studying with Chris and Bára. And I'll call your attention back to those in just a little bit, but they all have kind of similar forms. There's this kind of characteristic lengthening of a note at the very end of a line, which is a common kind of characteristic of them. They also are sung in small groups, 1 or 2 people. So that will become important later on. All right, Doug, can we get that next slide, please? So besides singing traditions in Iceland, there are musical instruments as well. A lot of scholarship, a lot of it has said that there were no instruments in Iceland. That is now not really debated as much within the music community in Iceland. There are instruments from Iceland. There have been long traditions of instruments being used there. And some of these include the Icelandic fiddle and the langspil. The Icelandic fiddle is quite an old instrument, but there's not very much that's known about it. There are no field recordings that have been made of it. This photo here of Jakob Árnason is one of the very few photos that we have of the Icelandic fiddle, and Bára and Chris, who have been doing quite a lot of research into both of these instruments, are a little skeptical as to whether or not Jakob actually was able to play the instrument. And this may have been a kind of staged photo, based off of there being several photos of him playing the instrument, but like from different sides of the instrument. So they also, admit that maybe it was played like that. We don't really have any evidence of what it sounded like or much evidence about how it was played. And it kind of appears to have died out before the 1900s. The second instrument is the langspil. And the langspil is an instrument that is in the zither family. Instruments in this family come from kind of all over the southern part of Norway, northern Germany. There are zithers in other parts of Europe as well. And you can see in this photo, it's being played with a bow, but it can also be plucked or played with a stick, as you saw in that video. Or sometimes that was done with the back of the bow. So it's kind of a percussive instrument as well. And then later, though it's not listed here, the psalmodikon came over as well from Norway, kind of in to the church music as a way of playing hymns. So these are a couple of the Icelandic instruments. As the instruments that are considered Icelandic, they are considered to fall within that kind of Icelandic canon of musical types and instruments. So these photos were both photos that I took of photos at the Siglufjörður Folk Music Center. And the Folk Music Center in Siglufjörður was the home of Bjarni Thorsteinsson. He was a priest in Siglufjörður and also a very avid music collector. And he is responsible for the major collection of Icelandic songs, many rimur melodies, and also tvísagnir and some psalms and church music as well. And he kind of collaborated with this network of friends and acquaintances all over the country. He placed ads in the newspapers to say, anyone who knows any sort of song, come to me or I'll come to you. So he traveled extensively over Iceland and collected folk music and eventually published it into this book. It didn't, the Icelandic government at first didn't want to publish this book. They thought, I don't know if it's so important. And he reached out to some friends of his in Denmark and was aided in the funding of the publication of this book by funders in Denmark. And the Icelandic government finally said, oh, if others are willing to fund this project, then maybe it's worth it. So we'll match their funding and help you fund the book. This book is still one of the major kind of resources for folk music in Iceland. But we can kind of see a little bit of an issue, which is that this canon of folk music that was created basically by Bjarni was created in the kind of the lead up to Icelandic independence. Bjarni was earlier than that, but his collection and then the nationalist movement leading up to Icelandic independence in 1944 set the stage to have there be a lot of people involved in this conversation about what is Icelandic, what counts as Icelandic, what should we include in Icelandic folk music so that we have a tradition to kind of carry into this new age of independence. And so there was a decision made during that time that Icelandic music should probably have Icelandic text. So a lot of, it should have Icelandic text, or it should be related to the fiddla or the langspil. At that time, if you remember, no one was playing the fiddla anymore, so it was already kind of a relic of an instrument. And the langspil was also not really being played very much. So we were left in the 1940s with a lot of songs and a lot of song texts counting as Icelandic folk music, a few instruments that were not being played by anyone really, and a lot of music that had been kind of pushed to the side as not being Icelandic enough. So during the time leading up to 1944 and the time after, there were lots of people coming to and from Iceland and bringing with them dance and music traditions or instruments. So there were fiddles, there were accordions, there were guitars, there were harmoniums. All of these different instruments did reside in Iceland, and people were playing music on them. Some of those tunes were imported tunes coming with the people who brought the instruments, but some were probably also written by Icelanders. So we'll get to that a little later. You can go ahead and switch slides, Doug. This is Siglufjörður. It's a really beautiful little town. All right, so if we think back to those videos, they all have this common kind of theme, that they're sung either solo or in pairs, not usually as a mixed group. You almost never see Tvísang. They're sung by more than two people, even if, you know, half of the group is singing one voice, half of the group is singing the other voice. And this causes a little bit of dissonance in how we think about building folk music community nowadays. Folk music communities, by kind of definition, need to be participatory. And so there are certain issues that arise when a music is solo in its nature and you want to bring it to a larger group. So it's things like this that are kind of the Icelandic music community now is looking at and trying to find ways to build community around both the music that was canonized and kind of collected in those early days of collection, the music that is appearing through scholarship, like fiddle tunes and accordion tunes, and how they're trying to build a community around that music that is inclusive of the solo traditions, but also aware that maybe things need to change a little bit in order to involve more people. One of the people who I spoke with in Iceland was Atli Hjaltason, who's a folklorist and ethnologist researching folk dance and folk dance music, as well as the performative aspect of folk dance and music. And he's working currently on looking at manuscripts of transcribed tunes written for accordion that have been found in Iceland. So these other types of music exist, and the community has kind of reached a point where there's a definite need for scholarship and community action towards kind of questioning the perception of what counts as Icelandic folk music, or what has counted, especially within the academic realm. Most studies have to do with rimur, or because you can study texts very easily. And that a lot of the movement right now is happening around that kind of reshaping of the definition. So along with this kind of reshaping of the definition of what the folk music is, there's also a lot of questioning and restructuring going on in how folk music is performed, how folk music is communicated to audiences, especially younger audiences, and what needs to be done to kind of facilitate that passing on of tradition within the community. You can go ahead and switch slides, Doug. So one of the ways this is happening right now is through things like the Vakka Folk Music Festival in Reykjavik, that has happened for 3 years now, I believe. Linus and Chris are some of the main organizers of that, though there are many others involved. And the Vakka Festival includes concerts, both done in the traditional style of a solo singer or multiple singers singing one at a time and singing things like rimur or tvísangur, and kind of newer constellations of folk music presentation, whether that be songs that have been arranged to be more choral in nature, or songs that have been modified to be played on instruments and things like that. The Vaka Festival also has a bunch of workshops. So there are practitioners holding workshops in dance and song, both from Iceland, and there were some workshops this year in kind of general folk dance. So kind of aimed at getting people acquainted with the skills that they need to maybe attend a more in-depth seminar or workshop. So they're really trying to broaden the field of who has access to this music and who may be interested in it. They had a group of kindergartners sing a concert at this festival. I think they had 30 kindergartners singing kveður. So they're really trying to cater to all ages, which is a really wonderful thing. Some of the other people who I talked to are also working on this, working on solving the issue of how to get this music to other people. One of them is Rosa Thorsteinsdottir, who's the custodian of the Árni Magnússon Institute's folklore collection. And that holds many of the recordings of Icelandic folk music that exist. Her aim is to make those recordings accessible for everyone interested. The website has a really wonderful, if you speak Icelandic, categorization system. So it's really, you can search for pretty much anything very specifically. And it's also very interesting because you can see, if you use those sorters to kind of sort for fiddle tunes or sung music, you can really see how few instrumental pieces there are in that collection. Linus, who I mentioned, is working on this problem by forming and leading a kveði group, a singing choir that is singing traditional songs, but as a working musician, he's arranged them to have multiple voices or arranged them to work with multiple singers in interesting ways. So working within the traditional frameworks to kind of expand the capabilities of those musics. And he's really trying to build up a young folk music community. And he does a lot of work in promoting and organizing things like the Vaka Folk Festival. And then, of course, there are Chris Foster and Bára Grímsdóttir, who perform and teach pretty extensively in Iceland and also abroad at festivals. Bára is pretty much the expert in rimur song, and she is a master, and she teaches workshops. She was teaching in the Arts Academy as well. And they also work to help organize this Vaka Folk Festival. So you can see that while I didn't include everybody who worked on organizing this festival, the group is very small. And when I asked all of these people kind of what their hope was for the future of the folk music tradition in Iceland, they all had very similar complementary answers to each other. They all mentioned that the size of the community is an issue. Having small communities makes it difficult to maintain the work power that is needed to sustain those communities, and you risk kind of people burning out, especially when all of that work is being done on a volunteer basis. So there are two issues there, I suppose. There's lack of funding and lack of numbers. The other thing that's kind of holding things back at the moment is a fragmentation of the folk music community, and that is kind of the separation of the singing and the dancing and the tune playing, and that those are run separately, and so they don't have the power they could have if they were all run under one umbrella organization. So all of the people I talked to spoke to the need of having maybe some sort of umbrella organization that could help facilitate these groups. They also spoke to the difficulty in getting grants to fund things like folk music. When you have grants, you need people on the other end of those grants who understand the project that you're trying to work towards. And there isn't a folk music specific category usually in those grants. And then just in general, policymakers at local and national level need to be made aware of Iceland's unique traditions and their richness and relevance on many levels in contemporary society. So these are all things that all of these people are thinking and working towards, and through things like the Vaka Folk Festival and the Siglufjörður Folk Music Festival, and various workshops and events that they're putting on, they're working towards these in really, really cool and inspiring ways. So the last question that I asked them was kind of their dream for the future of Icelandic music. And again, a lot of that centered around community and togetherness. So one person said that in the future, it would be favorable for these communities to continue to lead the scene together and make sure to maintain a positive and forward-moving discourse. And that these communities need to be inclusive and include academics, researchers, artists, performers, teachers, general hobbyists, and amateurs, as well as dedicated children and youth programs, senior programs, and more. So it was really interesting to come away from this experience and to hear the hope that everyone had for the music and the kind of inclusivity that is stemming from a music that, though it was sung maybe one or two people at a time, was usually sung for others in a group. So going back to those three types of music, rimur, tvísanger, both of these were performed not necessarily as performance pieces, but as, not as performance pieces on a stage, but as ways to connect in the downtime of everyday life. So there may have been a rimur singer sitting in the corner while other people were working in the evening when they were done working outside. And kind of like the radio actually served a role as this gathering place for people to connect around music. And what we're seeing in the movements and work that folk musicians in Iceland today are doing is a way of bringing that connection back and focusing it around something that is rooted in the tradition, but also has changed as traditions do to fit the times and to be a centering thing in today's society. You can go ahead and switch. So I want to end with thanking all of the people who I worked with in Iceland, the American Scandinavian Foundation for funding my work and travel there, Chris Foster and Bára Grímsdóttir for their year of lessons and advices, Rosa Þorsteinsdóttir for the archive work that she's done and for helping me navigate the archive, Atli Freyr Haldason for his work in the academy and looking into other types of dance music, Linus for his work in organizing the Vaka Folk Festival and just being an overall powerhouse in that world. Gabe Dunsmith, who is another musician friend of mine in Iceland. George Vasulis, who is currently or was managing the Siglufjörður Folk Music Center this summer. And my partner Al Soderblom, who put up with all of my research ramblings while we were in Iceland. So, and of course, for you all for having me on here to speak about this, and for everyone who joined in for coming to this talk. And I'd like to open it up for questions.
Please go ahead and enter your questions using the Q&A function. So while we're waiting for the questions to be entered, Kate, is there new music being written for these, especially the two-songer, what, I can't pronounce that. Not the Rimur, because the Rimur are the epic poems, but for the other music categories, and if so, is the content different or the music different than the traditional style?
That's a good question. I know of at least one new tvísanger composed by Bára Grímsdóttir, and that is a new setting of an old poem. So the text is old, but the music itself is new, and it's very cool. I don't know of any other new tvísanger. But there should be more because it's very interesting. And there are actually new rimur being written. People there at the Vaka Folk Festival, I think there were 4 new rima that were performed.
Okay.
So people are writing, and they're writing them. I mean, they are the epic style. They are thousands of verses, hundreds of verses at least. So those are still alive and well also, but they're a little less known partially because we now live in a more fast-paced society where people may not have the patience or time to sit through 1,000 verses of a song.
I can understand that. We do have a question that just came in. Were there people or a person in each community who was the keeper of song and or performer to keep the music alive?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer. I think that there were certainly people who were known for their ability to sing certain things. When you look on the archives, there are certain people who have a lot of songs, who are singing a lot of songs on those. And there were certainly people in communities that people thought had better voices. I don't think there were keepers of song necessarily, but people did have an opinion about who had the best voice for certain types of songs, and those kind of observations are recorded.
Okay. We also have another question. Does song content or style seem to vary by region in Iceland?
Content, I can't speak to a lot because my Icelandic is very, very rudimentary. So I get it most of my Icelandic through the Norwegian that I speak. So content, I'm not sure, but I would imagine there's some regional difference. Type of song, tvísanger, for example, were mostly collected from the Northeast, I believe. And there aren't very many of them that were collected, and they're all very similar. So they're kind of an interesting case of that, because maybe they were regional, but it's also possible that the person who was collecting them only collected in one region. And that kind of impacted what we view today as the region where those could have come from. So we may look at them and we could say, oh, all the tvísanger are kind of the same. Maybe they're all like that, and that's all the tvísanger that exist. Or we can kind of look at it from a different perspective and say, maybe we have to kind of question that a little bit based on collection methods and where and when people were collecting. So the regions of songs, I think, is a trickier question, especially for older songs.
All right, thank you. Are the old musical instruments, either the fiddle or langspiel, available for people to purchase? And if so, is it cost prohibitive?
So I know for sure that langspiel is widely, well, I say widely available. It's probably not, you can't go to any old music store and buy a langspiel, but langspiel is, because it's in that zither family and is played so widely, there are makers of langspiel. There are makers of langspiel, I think, even in the US, or there were at one time in communities that were German, and those instruments were basically the same. A lot of people also make their own langspiels. They're a relatively simple instrument, and so there are plans that you can purchase to make your own langspiel, and there are quite a few people who are doing that. The fiddle is an interesting case because it looks like a very simple instrument. It's basically a box with 2 raised bits on the ends and 3 strings. When asked, though, about why there aren't more fiddles, why people aren't making fiddles, people used to say, oh, well, it's too difficult of an instrument to make. But these were the same people who were making langspiels in their kitchens. So there's kind of a weird thing that happened where the instrument was going maybe out of fashion, and maybe it was something like the plans were more taught person to person as opposed to written down, and so how to make that instrument kind of disappeared. Whereas the langspiel, having come over from probably Norway, perhaps came with a set of plans, and so people were making that one, but we're not making new fiddles. So I think there are some reconstructions of fiddles, but I don't think there are many, if any, luthiers making them.
We have a question now about Reamer. Were the Reamer written or performed from memory? In other words, did people rely on oral tradition? And what stories or events were Reamer based on?
Yeah. So for the first part of that question, some people performed Reamer from memory and others performed them from reading. So Iceland was a really early country to kind of reach an extraordinary amount of literacy within its communities, and these Reamer were published and people would read them off. That being said, there were definitely people in communities who had at least large segments of rimur memorized. So it was kind of a mixture of both of those. Were they, let's see, what was the second part of that question?
Were they, was it written or oral? Was it tradition and things like that? So I think you've answered the question.
Oh, there was also what was the content?
Yes.
Yeah, it ranged pretty widely, and now with new rimur being written, continues to range widely. A lot of rimur have to do with kind of saga tales, epic poems, a hero, maybe some love, maybe some fights. Those were pretty popular. But one rimur can also be, it doesn't have to be long, they can be shorter and they can have different topics. That rimur, the tvísöngstemmer that we heard that had the langspiel played, that's a poem written by a poet talking about a stream that used to flow somewhere where he used to live as a youth, and talks about how he wants to visit that stream one more time before he dies. So there's also very sweet and poetic rimur out there. One of the newest rimur that was written, or is maybe, I don't know if it has been published yet, I think it has, is a rimur based on the life of Walt Disney. So, and it's thousands of verses long. So, I mean, there, or at least hundreds. So the content varies widely. You can write rimur on anything.
Apparently, Walt Disney, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we have one more question. Hi, Kate. Thank you for the interesting presentation. I am curious to hear your definition of living tradition.
Okay, living tradition. I have a feeling that this is a question that maybe I have a different answer to every day. But right now, my answer, I think living tradition to me is tradition that takes into account the things that have come before and the contexts that those things were applied in, the places where songs were sung, the events where dances were held, things like that, and tries to hold those at the same time while applying them to the contexts of the time that we're in now. So whereas we may not be gathering in our houses with no lights to listen to someone sing rimur, we can still approach that same kind of context of togetherness and telling a story through music in other settings today. So I think living tradition implies that there is change that is stemming from the understanding and respect for traditions and contexts of those traditions that have come before.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for all of your questions. Kate, thank you so much. This has been a very interesting presentation. I'm sorry I live so far away. It'd be fun to take one of your folk song classes, although you really wouldn't want to hear me sing. But before we go, I do want to let you know what is on the INLUS calendar. Our next set of the very popular INLUS Icelandic language classes starts on October 7th and runs through mid-November. Information on the classes can be found on our INLUS website, inlus.org. Our next webinar is quite different from this one. It's with Zachary Jordan Melton, who will present Vikings in North America and North Americans in Iceland. This is going to be a very interesting talk in which he talks about his thesis work on how Vikings were portrayed in film and early media. And then he will switch and talk about how North Americans viewed Iceland when they went there primarily for the millennial celebration prior to World War II. And in his talk, he's going to touch on ideas such as racial superiority, race, discovery, and destiny. So this webinar is going to be held on Wednesday, October 9th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. And then we're going to switch directions again. And on November 14th, we will have a very fun and interesting webinar by Bethany Rogers on the history of Icelandic food, which will include a demonstration of making skyr. And she's a lot of fun. She's a very entertaining presenter. So this will be one you'll want to tune in for. Beth lives in Iceland, so this is an early webinar. It'll start at noon Eastern and earlier for just about everyone else in North America. So put those on your calendar. We will have information coming out about those in our blog posts and always on our events calendar. We just want to say thank you one more time, Maggie. Or Maggie wants to say thank you one more time to Kate. Kate, thank you so much. And attendees, thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope to see you soon in our next set of classes or webinars. So thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.